Director of the International Policy Network. Julian, a very warm welcome to you. Your response to today's IPCC report in Paris?
Well, I mean, first of all, this is not a report from scientists. This is a summary maker for policymakers, which was actually put together partly by scientists and partly by people in the policy-making process themselves. So it doesn't necessarily reflect actually what those 2,500 scientists who are involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually say themselves. I mean, each scientist who contributed to that report will have probably contributed 1 or 2 pages and may well not agree with this policymaker's summary which has been produced. So,
but surely then they have an obligation to make sure that their names aren't being used by those who would suggest it is a consensus of 2,500 very good brains.
Well, in the past few years, a number of scientists have actually resigned from the IPCC because their criticisms, their concerns about the biases that are being sort of entwined within the process have not been taken into consideration. I mean, a good example was Chris Landsea, who's a professor who's an expert in hurricanes. And his concern was that the data on hurricanes over the past 100 years suggests there's not a strong relationship between hurricane intensity and the number of hurricanes and temperature. But this was overridden, and instead, as you can see in the policymaker's summary, they've relied instead upon the number of hurricanes more recently, and are making assertions that since 1970 there's a relationship between the number of hurricanes and temperature, which seems a little bit disingenuous. So, and I think there are a number of situations of a similar kind where scientists either haven't wanted to be involved in the IPCC or have decided to get out. Meanwhile, the entire report, not only the report that will come out in May, the full body, but also this policymaker summary, is predicated on economic analysis, which has been heavily criticised. And the economic assumptions which underpin the report were laid out in the in the third assessment report, which came out in 2001, in a thing called the Special Report on Emission Scenarios. And in that special report, there were assertions that the world would warm enormously, and as a result there would be huge rises in emissions. That's a scenario called A1 fuel intensive.
Well, we know as well, don't we, that the Stern report, of course, has been criticised for taking some of the worst-case scenarios as part of its analysis. But nonetheless, I mean, I know they've been using words like unequivocal. We've been parroting that word as well. But 90% is the figure they're giving, not 99%, 90% chance that global warming is a product of man-made activity. So in a sense, they're leaving a small, tiny bit of wiggle room for those who are increasingly described as, rather provocatively, I imagine, as deniers of global warming.
Well, I mean, the denier tag, I think, is somewhat offensive because it's clearly supposed to be associated with Holocaust denial and all those sort of things. But I mean, I think there is room for scepticism in various areas of the science. I'm not a scientist myself, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the science, but I can comment on the economics. And the economics underpinning this has been severely criticised. In terms of the science, well, you can say with 90% certainty, if you like, that there's been warming over the past century, and some of that has been the result of man's emissions. That doesn't really tell you very much at all. All it says is that we have some idea that the warming has taken place. Well, the data suggests that we've had maybe 0.7 Celsius rise in temperature over the past 150 years, which is when we have records for. And it seems plausible that given that man has emitted a lot of carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, that we could have contributed to that. But to say that is not to say that we should be alarmed about the rise in temperature, or more importantly, that we should be alarmed about any changes which might take place in the future. It's perfectly plausible that there could be a rise in global mean temperatures over the next 100 years. The question is, what should we do about it? And economists have analysed this in quite some detail, and they say, let's not impose massive restrictions on carbon dioxide and other emissions now, because to do that would be very, very costly. It would mean that the fuel prices go up, that would reduce economic growth, people would lose work, especially people in poorer countries would suffer because they are most in need now of being able to access clean, efficient, inexpensive energy technologies. It's probably a good thing that China's building about one very large coal-fired power station every week. Why? Because those coal-fired power stations produce clean electricity which gets distributed to homes, replacing the dirty fuels that people are currently burning in homes. In India, 70% of the population rely on burning dung and wood. in poorly flued fires in the countryside.
Okay.
I've seen young girls making pats out of dung, which then dried, and then those are burnt in huts in the village. What happens then is that millions of people suffer from respiratory infections. Over 1 million people a year, according to the World Health Organization, die as a result of those infections. Now, we can't see that as acceptable. We've got to allow people in those countries to use cleaner technologies, even if it means burning fossil fuels.
OK, Julian Morris from the International Policy Network. We appreciate your contrary view. Thank you.
Thank you.